How do I even start talking about Undertale? Like, it's about as close as an indie title has ever gotten to being a cultural touchstone for video games, right? Like, do I have to sit here and explain that once upon a time, noted Homestuck music composer Toby Fox made a charming little retro bullet hell RPG in 2015, and it, exploded Tumblr and the internet at large, and now he does music for Nintendo, Pokemon games, and Sans Undertale and Super Smash Brothers. Like what? What am I supposed to do? Hey kids, what about Undertale? Am I right? It's an RPG where no one has to die. No, seriously, that's how it's advertised, right? Like, even in the Kickstarter trailer, he has Flowey, like, explain that you can fight enemies, or you can spare them. It, along with great characters, a sense of humor, and an original soundtrack are the basic foundations of how this game was introduced to the public at large, and that's kind of novel, right? Like, you know, what if an RPG, a genre largely defined by such classic games as Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, and Luminous Arc 2, but you don't have to do combat, one of the foundational pillars of the genre. Well, it happened, and it was great. You don't need me to sit here and walk you through Undertale, obviously. Come on, guys. But he followed up the staggering success of this title with a follow-up project still in development, Deltarune. Wow! And here you can see that Toby Fox is trying to constantly toy and tease and complicate the structure of Undertale. You have recurring characters, same names even for most of them, but things are just a little bit different. You can't really do a no mercy run like you could in Undertale, where you kill everything you can. Where the game maybe has one ending, probably not. But the problem here is that in gesturing constantly at Undertale, its ideas, themes, mechanics, characters, it starts to reveal the artifice a little. Undertale was lightning in a bottle, honestly. I know that you may be hearing this and looking at the title of this video and freaking out that maybe, just maybe, I'm gonna call Undertale bad, but I'm not saying that. I genuinely think Undertale is good. Look, I even have a public statement here that states that I, Vivian Algren, in Sound, Mind, and Body, affirm that I do believe Undertale is a good video game. I even got it notarized. I actually didn't get the statement notarized, I'm sorry. The notary public that was, like, near me, the phone is disconnected, so I think that they don't have business anymore. And, like, I started looking up, like, you know, notary services in my area, and it just all felt a little bit too, you know, they have, like, an important job. Like, I'm not going to sit here and ask them to, like, run a joke, get, like, something signed as a joke. It just seems... However, Deltarune is working as an example, a kind of haunting image of just how precarious the balance of Undertale's execution is, and how easily it could have been upset had each piece of the puzzle not come together as cleanly as it did. If I'm going through Deltarune, a new game with new characters and a new idea of what kind of story it wants to say, a story that seems to want to be the inverse of Undertale, where Undertale is a story about your agency in a video game, Deltarune is about depriving you of agency in a video game, that should function just like its predecessor, why do I play these two chapters and only seem to think one thing? Can this game make me believe that killing enemies is a good idea? Okay, I'm going to cut through my usual meandering because I'm on a time crunch, and let's just try and get to the heart of things here. Undertale's moral framework is really simplistic, right? Like, what does Undertale say about violence but that it is bad? Like, okay, I do need to show my work, fine. Undertale's first act as a video game is to teach you about disobedience. Flowey shows up, gives you a weirdly sinister tutorial about the bullet hell mechanics, and tells you to run into the pellets. If you dodge the pellets, then the game progresses, accounting for that, showing you that you do not ever have to listen to the denizens of this game. You're saved from Flowey's attacks by Toriel, who then teaches you how to act and spare opponents, so that you can traverse through the game non-violently. You then have to disobey her orders to stay home in order to progress, where you enter into a fight with her, and so on. Fine. The tutorial in the runes teaches you beyond the puzzle solving and bullet hell, the bread and butter of the bulk of the game. The game proposes to you that the world is full of characters that are distrustful and will want things from you that you have to decide whether or not you agree to. The game even, near the end, assesses your morality through it in this final encounter with Sans Undertale, in a reveal that EXP and LV are acronyms for execution points and level of violence, you see. Gaining experience and levels like a regular RPG, that's what makes you a killer. It's a reveal that has a heady, kind of makes you think sort of vibe, if not for... Well, look, we'll get to it, but it also serves to center the game's idea of nonviolence directly. It is bad. It is bad when you seek to be violent. It's why Papyrus, the people's soft boy, can't actually kill you if you're on a pacifist run. It's the moral failing of Asgore that he forces you to fight, and if you do go through No Mercy, and you are out here to wipe out all of the monsters, then you're going to see everyone at their most violent, except Toriel, I guess, and by extension, their most tragic. The No Mercy run in particular is so hostile to you that the game will only, apparently, shame you for your decisions over and over until you make a promise to try the game again and not do this. I say apparently because Undertale is extremely good at presenting the moral framework, and I cannot bring myself to do anything other than pacifism in it. Like I'm here talking about it being all simplistic and naive, sure, but it works, and it works because Undertale is really, really well made. Let me see if I can put this in another angle. Undertale kind of operates like an anti-RPG. What do I mean? Okay, so instead of a classic retro RPG, the kind of genre the game's aesthetics all gesture towards, where you're constantly grinding levels and gear and all that, doing that in this game carries a real moral weight to it. Instead of a turn-based game where you each take turns throwing numbers at each other, every enemy turn is instead a bullet hell sequence that you actually have to dodge. Instead of a game that is a story that honors its own fiction and uses the mechanics as a pure abstraction to facilitate you through it, Undertale is meta. It's very explicitly aware and indulges in its status as a video game, with seemingly almost every character very much aware of the nature of their world, at least on some level. Beyond even the meta knowledge, a lot of the game's humor is built on a multitude of characters being genre savvy. Like, in isolation, a game that focuses on any of these qualities runs the risk of being almost insufferable. Like, the moral underpinning of the game is naive, a game flooded with genre-savvy meta-humor sounds exhausting in isolation, but, like, the overall effect of the game is relentlessly charming. Like, for context, I started out in this venture with a highly critical eye, worried that in the years since my first very emotional playthrough, I had grown so jaded and cynical and dead inside that the effect would be grating, but like, even now, I still get chills going through the final stage. You know, Toby Fox's sound design cannot be overstated here. He knows exactly how to complement every scene, every beat with machine precision. It's kind of one of the major pieces holding the artifice together so elegantly. In a way, the trailer for its Kickstarter highlighted its best features. Maybe he really knew that the game was going to live on the strength of its characters, humor, and soundtrack. Now what happened, right? Like, what changed from one game to the next that has me upset and griping like I am? It's not like Deltarune changed hands. He's written all of it, script and soundtrack even, but... Well, the violence moral is a weird thing to unpack here. Like, in a lot of ways, Deltarune seems hyper-conscious of what it's built upon. You know, Undertale is a game that is deeply invested in complicating, but ultimately honoring your sense of agency through it on a mechanical level, you know, to the point that all the moral extremes the game will either punish you explicitly or beg you not to play it again once you've made everything, you know, happy in the true ending, has set up a pretty strange dynamic with its fan base. I want to, seemingly apropos of nothing, remind people that this is a game that Matthew Patrick of game theory fame and or notoriety gave to the Pope. Like, it's a game that spawned some of his most unique theories. Hell, it's a game that was so on his mind that when he streamed Lisa the Painful, a game so brutally upfront about its thematic underpinnings of the way that pain changes you, all he could do is say that it reminds him of Undertale. I'll get to this point a little more later, but this does lay out one of the weird struggles going on with Deltarune as a game that is actively trying to downplay the fan relationship to violence in the original. Like, when the game was in the peak of its popularity, it was hard to go online and talk about it without the kind of dominant idea that you had to do pacifism and no mercy in order to do everything in the game, basically. This is why Deltarune Chapter 2 tried to codify more mechanics around the killing or sparing of enemies. Hell, like, Chapter 2 doesn't even, like, kill enemies now. They're lost and can't be recruited into your cafe. It's the kind of move that feels overly conscious of the looming specter of one of the most iconic games of all time. Like, it's a fine effort, but it reveals, at least in a small way, the bigger issues that we're getting into. It is conscious of the expectations put upon it, and in an effort to differentiate itself from Undertale, this new dynamic with violence feels oddly toothless. Like, Undertale pushes the question of violence to the forefront. In the No Mercy route, for example, violence is something you have to do to such an extreme that the game conspires against you, making every boss fight them at their most heroic and righteous, a world conspiring to save itself. One that ends with the jokey, funny character revealing himself to be quite strong, and in your brutal murdering of the villain of the story. And on the opposite side of things, the true ending, violence is propped up against you, something that Flowery insists that you will have to come to use eventually. The game even forces your hand in 2 fights, Asgore and Flowery himself, removing your capacity to sit around spamming the mercy button, though, you can still choose to spare them both at the end of their fights. Violence is portrayed as failing, should you indulge in it. Sans gives you a speech about it before the final battle, even. Violence is big and meaningful and rests at the heart of this game inescapably. What does Deltarune do with this? Well, explaining that may take a moment to go through, actually. Like, Deltarune's big issue isn't really any one thing about it. Standing alone, the game is fine. I had a good time with the first 2 chapters, but it kind of can't be a game that stands alone, can it? So let's take things back. Undertale is a game that cares about agency and choices. Part of why I don't have any of my own footage of other routes is that one of the big tricks Undertale did was keep track of your choices, save or no. Like, even after the true reset from the No Mercy run, the game remembers what you did, and apparently there are fucking soulless versions of the endings, whatever the point is that Deltarune is trying to be a dark mirror to Undertale, like, obviously, right? Beyond me waxing poetic about how the game is about not having agency, like, one of the main characters is Ralsei, an anagram of the main antagonist from Undertale, Azrael, who looks just like him, but this time, he's the ultimate fluffy soft boy. He's here to tell you about the Dark World and to not fight people. Like the opposite of what he did as Flowey in Undertale. Also, in the Light World, almost everyone from Undertale is here as a wacky NPC in this fun little town. Undyne is now a cop, which is horrible. Alphys is now your teacher. Your mom is now finally Toriel, who's also a teacher. Asgore is a gardener. They're divorced, just like in the end of the True Pacifist route. Everything is just a little off, like just a little different, and your effort to try and assert your own agency is in direct tension. Chris is 2 people, the soul that you pilot and their soulless self, functioning as the knight that opens the dark pillars that are the dungeons you go through each chapter. And no matter what you want to do, Chris is both protagonist and antagonist. Conceptually, it's fine, right? And, this is where my struggles with the game really start to take hold. Okay, so Susie is kind of the deuteragonist of the game, along with Ralsei, but Ralsei kind of gets smaller little arcs here and there. The story is mostly about Susie, a monster with a horrible reputation of unchecked violence and aggression. She's the school bully, and in getting dragged into the Dark World, she's pulled into developing a friendship with Lancer, then Chris, even Ralsei, and that growth is explored more in Chapter 2, which hinges on minor character from Chapter 1, Noelle. Her anxieties, her strained relationship with Birdley, her attraction to Susie, and how Susie responds to having someone she's attracted to reciprocate those feelings. It's the best parts of Deltarune, when the game is being its own game about, Susie and Noelle and our wacky antagonists. And I'm supposed to say Birdley, but honestly I don't like how the game writes him. I'm sorry. In these moments, the game feels more like a regular RPG, a game that's using mechanics as a means of honoring and presenting the story it actually wants to tell, and it's great. But then so much of the rest of the game feels off. Like, it has a lot of characters and elements and plot points that exist just to kind of gesture towards intrigue, right? What has Ralsei done in this game outside of explain plot points at us and be the angel on our shoulder? And more to the point, what does Chris do as our twin protagonist and antagonist? They're in a theoretically interesting position in a story which rests, as of Chapter 1 and 2, at the heart of the major thematic question. If this is a story about not being able to make meaningful choices, about our lack of agency, what are we supposed to take away from a game that gives us agency in one context, but one that doesn't culminate in a meaningful deviation to the story otherwise? It's a captivating question, and one that propels me to one of the fundamental shortcomings of making this video. Like, we're a decent way in by now, and I'm sure if anyone is watching me speculate about Deltarune on the internet for some reason, may have already at least thought to tell me that the story isn't finished yet. And yes, I know, but what am I supposed to do with that information? Toby Fox has released these chapters as demos for the rest, right? Are we just supposed to infinitely wait for him to provide us with the full game under the assumption that anything we find frustrating or confusing or bad are just going to be made good in the next chapters? Before starting this video, I was told by a frankly worrying number of people in my life that I had to play Chapter 2 before I make any assertions about Deltarune as something that is more limply gesturing at Undertale than meaningfully contributing to the conversation Undertale had with us back in 2015, that, a Chapter 2 would show me just how wrong I am, and all I've seen in Chapter 2 has been more of the same. More high points, sure. Susie's great. Noelle's great. I thought Queen was actually a way better antagonist than Lancer. I hated Birdley. I thought that the game's kind of insistence on making him a comic cutout of a nerdy misogynist feels old and tired and obvious, and it probably would have too in 2021. We know that nerds can be sexist freaks, and his character depth, digging into him, didn't really improve him much either. I don't know, he's a deeply self-conscious kid held to a standard that he feels he didn't legitimately earn, and it turned him into kind of a bully and kind of a pig. That's fine, but that's kind of the problem here, right? In pulling away from the refined artifice of Undertale, a game made up of beautiful spinning plates, all balanced nigh perfectly, the game's underpinning vibe of playing a little morality tale for young adults, it gets kind of floated to the surface. We're school kids. Susie's a school bully who eats chalk and makes threats that kind of never culminate in anything, but she's not actually as violent as people think she is. Birdley sucks, but he's a child. We're supposed to get that, right? It's obvious in a really big way, and devoid of the framework that Undertale puts you into, a framework that points obviously toward engaging with it non-violently. Deltarune feels almost like an after-school special, or in its best moments, it kind of hits that Totoro vibe of giving itself the maturity to have kids meaningfully deal with the far more complex problems the adults in their lives are going through, and the fallout of those issues affecting their outlooks and behaviors. Noelle has no confidence in herself because her mom is very strict on her, and her fun-loving dad is in the hospital, and it is heavily implied that he may never come out of it alive. Chris is dealing with his brother gone from school and with his parents divorced. There's a lot you can find that reveals tiny things about the characters in the town, and it's fine, but it's kind of made infinitely frustrating because the specter of Undertale not only looms large on the game, paratextually, but also, well, textually. All of these characters are back, and it's kind of up to us to figure out what's different. Papyrus is missing for a running gag, maybe. Undyne and Alphys don't even know each other, but in Chapter 2, you can start to help them get back together. Sans and Toriel don't really know each other, but, the same dynamic is there, right? Wow, there's just so much stuff here to make you go, wow, do you think that Chris is the soulless true pacifist Frisk run? Oh god, look, I've been dancing around this for what feels like centuries, but I can't even really continue talking about the thematic ideas of these two games, because I know about Snowgrave, okay? So, in Chapter 1, there are only two endings, neutral and pacifist, and the plot points are essentially the same, just you can go back and talk to all the enemies you fought and spared earlier, like an echo of Undertale. Do you remember Undertale? However, in Chapter 2, outside of neutral and pacifist endings, is the Snowgrave ending. I, in fact, was lying to you about not being able to kill enemies in Chapter 2. Sort of. The game plays it very, coy in this, but the part of the game where you have Noelle in your party and you use her ice attack to freeze an enemy that deals fatal damage, they're frozen solid and stay that way for good. If you do this to every enemy in that section of the game, when it's time to fight Birdly, she has a spell called Snowgrave that she resists using, begging you not to make her cast the spell because she doesn't know what it does. If you push her enough to do so, then she uses it on Birdly, and he's fatally frozen. The game gets weird from there. Like, it kind of cuts you through the bulk of the story, kind of the way the No Mercy run in Undertale solves a bunch of puzzles for you, and instead of fighting the main villain of the tale, just like in Undertale, the wacky comedy side character becomes the final boss, though in this case it is internet cult favorite Spamton, who I don't care for. I'm sorry. I get that he's like a busted advertisement mashup of a Death of a Salesman reference, but like that's fine. But I feel like I just have no idea why the internet likes him to the level that they do. Like, this may be my most controversial hot take of the video. If you want to comment that it's actually very deep because in his final forms, both as a secret boss in the regular path and as a final boss of Snowgrave, it's symbolically interesting because he's a puppet on strings, and isn't that kind of like Chris? Which, yeah, that's fine. I'm sorry. I'm not into it. The point here is that these games are kind of bitterly engrossed in the fan culture around it. Like, okay, I have a confession. I'm sort of weirdly into Five Nights at Freddy's. That isn't to say that I think the games are good. I haven't played any of them, or that I think the lore is good, or the storytelling is good. I don't like either of them either, but I find the way the series developed as something where the creator was constantly fucking with his fan base, who in turn would just endlessly fall for his bait and switches without fail, kind of engrossing. Like, at some point, FNAF is just wildly antagonistic to its fan base, right? Like, I get that vibe a lot with Toby Fox, and that kind of comes from how weirdly hostile and sadistic both of these titles are, you know? Like, I already was saying that Undertale's kind of an anti-RPG, and that is partly at the player's expense, right? Like, a lot of the gags and the meta-nods are ribbing you for likely being genre-savvy. You know, you have to grind to a comical amount of enemies by the end of No Mercy, where Flower not only calls you out, but anyone watching Barry and Ross's playthrough of the game, which is exactly where this footage is from, sorry, Game Grumps. And that vibe extended entirely into Deltarune. You know, large swaths of the game feel dedicated to messing with obsessive fans who want to make deep lore revelations out of it. You know, is Chris soulless pacifist Frisk? Is this an alternate history? Is this secretly a prequel? Does Sans Undertale know who we are? All of the character beats going on with all the returning casts feels endlessly like a wink and nod to the fact that people are going to want to try and draw a cohesive extended universe canon between these two games against Toby Fox's explicit wishes. Like, yes, Undertale doesn't care about taking you through the two extreme endings. The game was built for you to have your experience and then leave it alone. Or is it? Like, okay, sure, on some level you can just play super nice and pacifist up through your first neutral playthrough, get the recommendation from Flowey to maybe talk to Alphys after reloading, but you could, of course, just not. But Flowey does, in fact, canonize a reset in order to get an ending and suggest that you do just that, right? Like, Undertale has the benefit of being made in a world where Undertale didn't already exist. Toby Fox was having kind of sadistic fun with the player, and that helped to offset the kind of treacly vibe that the game would have otherwise had, right? Like, in contrast, Deltarune is kind of doomed, right? Like, the fans are already here. Toby Fox is making another Undertale, and as much as there's a lot of specific effort put into telling us that this ain't Undertale anymore, from the opening character gen being thrown out to the traversal into the Dark World redoing and replacing your regular old Undertale UI, but more and more of that effort put into Deltarune comes off as antagonistic than anything else, right? Let's hone back into Snowgrave. There is one interesting thing going on here. Just an interesting little idea that rather than the No Mercy run of Undertale, which is an extension of your absolute agency on the game, Snowgrave is more a conversation about the agency you do have in a game that's about the deprivation of agency, control over your party members. It is genuinely a neat thing to do because Noelle doesn't have agency over her own actions when you control her in the game, and while the game snaps you back into the general ending beats of Chapter 2, you've managed to exert some small part of your agency into the world. The ending's a little different. it is, frankly, the best argument to be made to answer the question I had up at the top, right? Like, yes, maybe killing these enemies is a good idea, because otherwise there is no meaningful way to express my agency in a story that seems indifferent to my actions in it. But no, right? Like, I didn't feel frustrated by my lack of agency in playing the game the way I always do, which is to say, utterly non-violently. I felt like I was playing the game and enjoying the story. You know, the biggest change from Chapter 1 to Chapter 2, frankly, is the ephemeral idea, rather than this being a story that cannot really be changed from your actions. You know, it's a game that is on a path that you may be able to destroy. And, like, here's the thing, it's a problem that felt a little understandable in Undertale. If you have absolute agency in the story to the point that you can just grind and kill every enemy in the game would have to account for that and give you some kind of meaningful response. But here, Snowgrave, despite being on its own kind of interesting and thematically appropriate, feels also perfunctory, right? We didn't get to be a sick freak in Chapter 1. You know, why the fuck not? That's part of the Undertale experience. So now, here, you know, just ruin Noelle's life instead. It feels arbitrary as much as it feels thematically coherent, and maybe it's because they just didn't draw this kind of focus in Chapter 1, despite having a character that is the angel to Susie's devil, right? Like, Ralsei wants you to not be violent in this game from word go, and his input just isn't really something that the game weighs on the matter outside of, you know, the text. So now, suddenly, we've decided that it is important for Noelle, and yes, that could be justified in text, because defeating doesn't mean killing anymore, and Noelle freezes them instead of, you know, whatever, but, like, I get it, but the fact that this has been implemented in the same chapter that also tacked on a mechanical breakdown for violent versus non-violent combat makes the whole thing feel like a step backwards, deeper into the amalgam of Undertale's prestige. And that kind of makes Snowgrave emblematic of the entire problem, doesn't it? It is, like Deltarune, simultaneously a kind of deeply interesting reflection on the themes and ideas the game brings as Undertale's dark mirror, but it is also consumed by it due to its need to replicate its structure and characters so much. Deltarune, as it exists now, seemingly cannot get out from under its predecessor's shadow in a really explicit way that stretches far beyond the inevitable fan obsession over it, and that kind of makes the experience of playing it, listening to all the good new songs, enjoying Susie and Noelle and Queen, and maybe not really many of the rest of the cast, kind of bittersweet. Like, I'm not sitting here at the end of Chapter 2 freaking out about, like, what's gonna happen to Chris or Toriel, or if Chris is the knight they are, or if Ralsei is Asriel, probably. But I'm just lamenting what the game's going to do next. You know, which new character am I going to get invested in and ultimately get fed up as like the game continues to try and let me know that this isn't Undertale anymore, again. Like, what's the point of caring about Susie if her story's just gonna keep getting pushed to the side so that way we can build hype and intrigue about whether or not Undertale is gonna jump out the shadows, and, like, Toby Fox will let us know that this definitely connects textually to everyone's favorite 2015 indie RPG. You know, what made Undertale good wasn't any one particular thing, but the balance each element struck with each other. In a game that is trying to tear itself apart to both be Undertale and its antithesis, it feels exhausting. And yes, you know, maybe I'm going to be wrong about this, and that Snowgrave or the following chapters do something genuinely wild and interesting and makes the game feel like it has its own real identity, and I'll feel like a real idiot for this video, but I'm just not on board with what Deltarune has given us. I like exactly some of it, but not enough to go back and get the secret bosses or do Snowgrave myself or anything like that, and unless the next few chapters or whatever can actually make it feel like Deltarune is meaningful and interesting and good by itself, I don't know if I can just keep playing what feels like a professional Undertale fan game. Also, shoot, I was gonna say that H. Bomber Guy's video on Undertale ruined my life for a few weeks because, like, of course I wanted to have Toriel be my mom when I played the game. It was, like, 2017, and I was really depressed, and, like, come on, guy, like, why would you say these kinds of true things? Like, just let me have my pie. Wait, don't run the credits yet. Wait. Special thanks to Alexi Angelica, Bees the One, Caitlin Fisher, Colleen T., Evan Kearns, Gail Simmons, Lewis Wells, Lorez, Maria Alatren, Michael McNay, Nurai the Redmarked, Professor Popper, Saint Rawberry, Thomas Volpes, and Zetetic.